And they wrote everything down. I mean, they have dictionaries, poetry, literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, as you said, receipts that tell us what people ate, how much onions cost, how much beer cost, the earliest written sciences, medical texts that tell us about everything from mental health to urinary tract diseases, astronomical texts that tell us about the earliest development of the zodiac, letters between wives and husbands complaining that they have too much to do and please come home and help me. It's just the most stunning, breathtaking corpus of information about people in their own words.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Between two rivers, that is Mesopotamia, sometimes called the Fertile Crescent. We're traveling back in time, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, thanks to Moudhy Al-Rashid, the author of a new book, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History. You bet. Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We've known them in war cultures, but this is the beginning of language as we understand it, written language, also kingship, also school days, the same, and we will come to that. Moudhy, congratulations, and this is wonderful. You teach at Oxford College. I envy your students because they are taking the same time trip we're about to routinely with you. We go to a princess, Engeldi Nana. The princess is in the city of Ur. Her father is a king, and he burdens her and blesses her by making her the priestess of the moon god. So she inherits, if I follow correctly your reporting, an enormous task, the farms, the people, the wherewithal, the fertility of the land. Plus, she's an interlocutor to the moon god. And she left behind a chamber, or a series of chambers. And in that chamber were artifacts from the civilization she lives in. But they were not all her time period. Some were 1,000 years before or more. Who is she? What do we need to know about her before we explore the mystery of her chambers? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you too. Thank you for having me, and thank you for starting with Enigaldi Nana. She is at the center, really, in a way, of the new book. She is, as you said, the daughter of the last independent Babylonian king, King Nabonidus. After him come the Persians, and he appointed her as the high priestess to the moon god, who is called Sin in the Akkadian language, which was the language in use by the Babylonians, like Enigaldi Nana, but also called Nana in Sumerian, which is the ancient language of the region kept alive by scribes and scholars, sort of how Latin was kept alive for a very long time and still is in many ways in certain restricted contexts. And Enigaldi Nana, when she inherited this role, her father made sure that she had somewhere to live in Ur, a city on which would have been on the banks of the Euphrates thousands of years ago. And in the remains of her palace, excavators discovered a room that they really thought they wouldn't find very much in. It just kind of looked like a mass of rubble. But they were very careful to say that the floor was intact. And the reason for that is really that the reason for making sure that that was known was because, as you said, a series of artifacts were discovered in that room atop that floor from much, much earlier eras. A mace head, so part of a weapon that was so old they couldn't actually date it in the end. A description of a brick that came from 1,500 years before Enigaldi Nana even lived, and several other artifacts that were just didn't really make sense to find them in that room. And then they found something that really unlocked the mystery of that collection, which was a cylindrical clay object covered in cuneiform writing, which was the writing system in use for thousands of years in the region. It was a writing in clay, so it was impressed with reed onto clay, which was sort of the paper, the main medium for the writing system, which is why so much of it has survived. And on this object was another object was described as being there for display, and that object was a brick which was never found. But it was described in such detail that we may as well have found it because we know exactly what was said on it and what it looked like and how it was discovered and where. So really, excavators decided this must be some sort of collection of antiquities or even a museum. And that drum-shaped or cylindrical clay object was the earliest known museum label. There are lots of ways to interpret it, but that is, I would say, one of the most evocative that really gives us a window onto how much history mattered to the people of this region, who kept their dead languages alive, who wrote about their ancient kings, and who made sure they could connect themselves with earlier eras to lend themselves legitimacy because of how important the long history was to them, as it in so many ways is to us as well.
So her father is king, and
Hmm.
he puts her in charge not only of land
Hmm.
and fertility, but also of memory. It's striking to me because I can remember being taught that it was modern man who invented history
Hmm.
and moved it away from God's intervening. And you give me to understand that at least one king, and perhaps the tradition, venerated our ancestors who came before us on the basis of artifacts. Is that something that was well established until they found the princess's chamber?
Yes, it was. In fact, Nabonidus is very well known for his almost obsession with archaeology. He and his dynasty, the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, which is sort of 600s and 500s BCE, they sort of pop up out of nowhere in the dust of the fall of the preceding empire, the Assyrian Empire, which at the time was the largest empire the world had ever known. So they had to have come up with a sort of creation story, and they did that by connecting themselves with much earlier kings, including kings who came, almost 2,000 years, who ruled almost 2,000 years before them. So they were all sort of aware, and they had all these artifacts of this very, very ancient history. And it was important to them to create that link to an earlier dynasty, to lend their own selves legitimacy. And Nabonidus more than anyone else, because he doesn't come from any sort of royal genealogy or anything like that. He sort of takes over the throne after a sort of messy period between the other kings who came before him, and he also brings an end to the dynasty. So it was quite an established practice of these kings and kings who came before them as well.
I want to interpret for modern times because of the way we deal with leaders now. He was seeking legitimacy, or he was endorsing his legitimacy. Is that it? Could the artifacts have been giving him that power?
Possibly. They may have also just been sort of as part of his overarching strategy of legitimacy, which involved a lot of excavating of older temples and then rebuilding them as they looked in ancient times. And in the course of these sort of building works, they would just find lots of old things. And his own accounts of these building works describe having found an inscription of an ancient king, and he might name the king, or even an inscription of an ancient high priestess, because the role that Enigaldi Nana took on is a very, very old role. It's a very old position that originates in the third millennium BCE. So she's in a long line of priestesses. And Nabonidus describes having found an inscription of one such priestess called Enanadu, who lived around 1800 BCE. And so I think it's really all part of this sort of the practicality of rebuilding these old buildings to as symbols of his connection to the past, but also having kept them, maybe there was some power to them in that sense and kept them together. But there are a lot of questions around it as well, which I tackle in my book, because I think there are other ways to approach it that don't necessarily detract from the importance of that history. That in a way, the sort of doesn't matter what the answer is, but because the fact that the objects are there is by itself so interesting.
This is the city of Ur, and it's in the first millennium BCE,
Hmm.
meaning that the Greeks and the Romans are in this period too. However, we're going back in time. We leave the first millennium BCE and we travel back in time. There are 4 or 5 cities that are necessary to talk about, and each of them are built of bricks. What kind of bricks? Bricks from the mud, the clay mud of the Tigris and Euphrates, which are going back and forth like whipping snakes over these thousands of years. 3,000 was wetter than 2,000, and the climate of today is not typical of all of these periods. So I just mentioned climate is a moving story too. But we go to the bricks that themselves that build the cities. I learned from you they tell a story, sometimes a purposeful story of strength, sometimes acknowledging to gods. There are millions of bricks. You seem to have come up with some winners. How did you do that, Moody?
Yeah, so I mean, I mean, millions and millions of bricks that still scatter the landscape of modern Iraq and Syria and the surrounding neighboring countries. And once upon a time, in the first millennium BCE, someone found one of these very ancient bricks, which came from around 2000 BCE, and decided to keep it. And we're not sure why. It may have been because this was a brick that had a curse on it, that may have had a curse on it that said that whoever damages this statue that this brick is holding up, may their offspring be cut off. In other words, may their future line be cut off. And bricks really tell us it's not a sort of very romantic object, but they can really tell us a lot about people's beliefs. Buildings, in a way, are stories. And I think architecture can tell us a lot about what people thought was important. So temples, for example, of course, tell us how important deities were. A temple in ancient Mesopotamia was actually the house of a deity. The word for temple in Sumerian, one of the languages, primary languages in use in the region, is just the sound eh, and it means house. And similarly, in Akkadian, the other primary language used in the region at the time, it's bitu, which may sound familiar to anyone who speaks a Semitic language. Sounds like bait in Arabic, for example, and that also just means house. So these temples, they went to great efforts to build these towering ziggurats with temples on top of them as earthly homes of these deities. And these are huge logistical undertakings involving tons of people, vast skill sets, labor hours, materials, and coordination. But then things like city walls can also tell us that at some point people thought it was important to encircle their city with a wall. And one of the earliest cities, sometimes called the earliest city, although I think there's new archaeological evidence that's dethroning that title, is called Uruk. And the wall around Uruk was 9 kilometers long. And millions of bricks. I can't remember the exact number, but it's sort of tens of millions of bricks must have been used to build this wall. But even residential architecture can tell us something. The way bricks were used inside houses. Inside people's houses, there were crypts where they buried their dead family members. And of course, they're sort of topped with bricks. And so it tells us something about that sort of sensory experience of death and grief and how people wanted to stay close to the people they had lost. So something as foundational and seemingly boring as a mud brick can really tell us so much about society, about what people thought was important, of worth building, and worth keeping, including in a possibly very ancient museum.
The bricks are made from clay, and how do they turn that clay into something solid to build with? What's the process, Moody?
Yeah, so they use these sort of molds made out of baskets, and they would mix clay and straw or reed, and sometimes animal dung, all together, and then they would dry them in the sun en masse. I mean, millions of bricks would be drying en masse. For very important building works, they would bake them to ensure that they were really solid. And then they would stick them together with bitumen, which really sort of bubbles up in the landscape of ancient Iraq, in particular sites in the region, and would be transported for use on major building works. But if they didn't have access to bitumen, or for something that's not so important, something that's not as important as, say, a temple or a palace, they would just use more mud to stick the bricks together. So really, their architecture, the building blocks of their society come from their landscape, as do the building blocks for their writing system also come from the landscape. They're really rich, fertile landscape.
For you who understand that all dogs are the best dogs in the universe, we now go to a paw story in the bricks. What have we found?
Yeah, there's so many lovely examples of this. So, if you imagine all these bricks laying out to dry in the sun, there would be animals out and about, including dogs. And there are some lovely bricks that preserve the paw prints of a dog. I think the dog would have been about 30 pounds or so. So, maybe a mastiff puppy or the size of a collie who's just walking around and left their paw prints for posterity. But there are also human footprints too on some of these bricks, footprints of kids who may have been running around the drying bricks as well. And it's just such a lovely little window onto Yeah, our canine friends thousands of years ago.
Are there bricks that are special and written on, or is it random when you find the bricks?
Yeah, great question. So some bricks get stamped with an inscription, and we sort of in the field call it the earliest printing press because it's essentially a stamp. And there have been stamps recovered in archaeological excavations. They're not a kind of theorized thing, with the inscription in reverse on it, and then they would just stamp the brick, and the inscription would come out in the correct order, usually saying the name of the king responsible for the building works, and the name of the building or the god that the building is dedicated to. For example, the in Ur, if we go back to Ur, where Enigaldinana served as the high priestess to the moon god, the ziggurat there, the great ziggurat there, which is still there. The bricks are a lot of the bricks are stamped with the earliest builder of that ziggurat, whose name is Ur-Nammu, and he lived around 2000 BCE. So it says something like building built by Ur-Nammu in dedication to the moon god, something that simple. But what the stamps do is they make it possible to stamp many bricks without having to rely on the expertise and time of a scribe. Anyone could stamp a brick. So it was, yeah, quite an interesting innovation that they made.
Did they understand that the bricks, if stamped, gave strength to the walls that wouldn't have been if it wasn't stamped, or was it a contractor's game?
That's a great question, actually. I do think that the stamps carried a great importance because they wouldn't have bothered otherwise. And they do bury inscriptions dedicated to the gods as well. So in a way, these are all messages to the gods saying, I did this for you. Look what a good king I am. Look what a pious king I am. So even if people couldn't read the inscriptions, the gods surely could, was the idea. So I do think it lent added importance, added meaning to these building blocks.
And the ziggurat in Ur and the ziggurat in Uruk, were they built with different kinds of bricks or the same as the walls?
Pretty much the same. I mean, there's some variation in shapes across the time periods and for certain buildings, but overall they use the same materials, the same methods, the same drying or baking, and the same mortar. So either the bitumen or more mud. So there was quite a bit of shared building strategies across the entire region.
Between Two Rivers, I'm spending time with the author Moudhy Al-Rashid, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History. This is a teacher of languages and culture at Oxford University who's going to introduce us to storytelling 3,000, 4,000 years ago, just like today. But the story they all liked, just as we today have our favorites, Paul Bunyan, for example. The story they all liked is a king named Gilgamesh. He was 9 feet tall, goes the
Mhm.
yarn, and he was cruel. And then he met a companion, and that companion guided him to understand that generosity and justice were the role of a king once upon a time. However, how do we know this? What were the languages that were commonplace in Uruk and Ur and Kish and Babylon? And how are those languages remembered and conquered? I'm greatly privileged to be speaking to someone who can not only read Sumerian, but she can speak Sumerian. Moody, Sumerian is the older, Akkadian is the newer. What what do we need to know about those languages and how they were used?
Well, the first thing to know about them is how do we know about them, which is that they are recorded in a writing system called cuneiform. So they share a writing system, even if the languages are unrelated, just like we write French and English and German with some variations in this using the same alphabet. Although cuneiform is not an alphabet, strictly speaking. So it's a writing system developed around 3350 BCE, or at least its precursor was. And that's, a writing system that therefore gets used for over 3,000 years. That's half of human written history is in this writing system. And as you said, Sumerian is the more ancient of the main languages that it was used to write, and Akkadian, the newer one. And although the two are not related, the speakers of Akkadian from around 2000 BCE, once Sumerian died out, made took great pains to keep that dead language alive. They translated the literature, they kept alive proverbs in the Sumerian language, and they used it for, particularly special documents. And even some medical literature employs Sumerian spells and incantations to heal people. And they wrote everything down. I mean, they have dictionaries, poetry, literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, as you said, receipts that tell us what people ate, how much onions cost, how much beer cost, the earliest written sciences, medical texts that tell us about everything from mental health to urinary tract diseases, astronomical texts that tell us about the earliest development of the zodiac, letters between wives and husbands complaining that they have too much to do and please come home and help me. It's just the most stunning, breathtaking corpus of information about people in their own words, telling us what they thought was important, what they experienced, and as with literature today, telling us what sorts of themes they really grappled with, and what they thought was worth thinking about.
Gilgamesh,
Mhm.
magical. Who was he? What do we know? Did he exist?
That's yeah, the million-dollar question. He's a legendary king, but we do think that there must have been a real Gilgamesh of some kind at some point, even if we haven't found contemporaneous records of him. And he survives primarily through stories, and most famously, a tale written in the Babylonian dialect of the Akkadian language called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this story tells, I mean, you can ask 10 people who have read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you'll get 10 different accounts of what the main themes of the story are. But essentially, you start off with this tyrant, Gilgamesh, who tortures his people. He forces them to fight with each other for sport. He forces them to build this humongous wall, which does survive archaeologically, this 9 kilometer long wall, and worse. And it's about his transformation from this tyrant into a good king. And along the way, he meets his match in the form of a companion and possibly lover called Enkidu, a wild man who's described as being born in silence. In other words, he's not born out of childbirth. He just pops up in the wilderness one day and makes his way to Uruk to meet Gilgamesh through a series of circumstances. And they become great friends. They have this beautiful love story and they go on all these adventures. And then Enkidu dies. And that's a real wake up call for Gilgamesh. He starts to panic about mortality and he goes on this quest for immortality. And instead of finding the key to immortality, he finds this deep wisdom about life, from the oldest man in the world who survived the great flood, that you have replicated in the Bible, for example. And this wisdom is essentially that life can be over in a second, and it's not about your personal survival, it's about the survival of the community. And he takes this wisdom back and becomes a really good king. So it's this beautiful, moving story about everything from love, loss, and to wisdom, to what it means to be a king and what it means to live, really.
And it's dated in a period that we believe Gilgamesh was also a king. I think that one way I can translate this is, was he their King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table?
That's a lovely analogy, actually. I think something like that would make sense. He may have ruled, if he was a real figure, in the probably the early third millennium BCE. So let's say 2800-ish BCE. And there were surely oral stories about him that then get committed to writing much later, around 2100 BCE, first in Sumerian, and then they kind of get mashed together into this later Babylonian or Akkadian epic that's very, very long. That's 12 tablets long, or 12 chapters, let's say. And it's really beautifully written, but the Sumerian ones are also beautifully written. This is really high poetry that we're talking about this king.
Would any Galdi Nana known the stories of Gilgamesh that you just mentioned?
I mean, I can't say for sure, but I would say yes, she most likely knew, especially as a daughter of a king, because almost every king wanted to show that they were somehow something like Gilgamesh in some way, some more directly by claiming to have a shared genealogy, with him, or being connected with his mother, who is a goddess. But she certainly would have known who Gilgamesh was, even if there's no written piece of evidence that says, I, Enigaldi Nana, knew. who Gilgamesh was.
Oh, 2,000 years later, it's commonplace, the Gilgamesh story, a detail about the Gilgamesh story. The
Mhm.
word king itself, you have you give attention to that wasn't king wasn't right away. There were lords. I
Hmm.
believe the letters en, is that Lord N?
Hmm. And exactly.
And so where did the kingship idea come from?
That's another great question that we're still struggling to answer. But there is an kind of Babylonian version of where kingship comes from, and the historical records just state that kingship descends from heaven in the city of Kish, which is very close to Babylon. So that's one way to account for it, is just something that spontaneously arises. But it's more likely that there was a kind of gradual development from this Lord figure, who appears in really early sources. And some of the earliest examples of writing reference of the N of the city of Uruk, for example, or maybe it's Jemdet Nasser. I can't remember exactly. And then the arc again, going back to this idea of buildings telling a story, archaeology, sort of architecture, tracks this political development, because again, in the city of Kish, we start to see buildings that are not temples, but that are quite lavish and beautifully decorated and huge. And the idea is possibly that these are the earliest palaces, because temples don't get abandoned. They just get built, rebuilt, renovated, and rebuilt over and over again on the same site because they have that much importance. But a palace can be abandoned, and these buildings do get abandoned and serve as cemeteries in later periods, and they look like they were probably abandoned quite quickly. So it's possible that in the sort of early third millennium BCE, we start to see the figure of a king arise who deserves his own palace, and this idea of a single leader of a city that then gets passed down through bloodline as opposed to some other method of choosing the city's leader. But it's such an interesting question. There are other ways that scholars have tried to account for it, suggesting that, for example, kings might be the husbands of goddesses, who were at the kind of stronghold of the pantheon in the really early periods, and then later displaced by gods. But that's yeah, yet to be completely proven.
Now we come to a mystery, Sargon of Akkad.
Mhm.
I've already tasked Moody to find Akkad. Who is Sargon? Why do we start with him?
So Sargon is a leader who rises in around 2330 BCE. And he brings the Akkadian language to, I mean, he and his people bring the Akkadian language to the region. And what's interesting about Sargon is that we have this first example of really vast expansion of an empire. Before him, it was city-states, and they all kind of ruled at the same time independently, and maybe they fought with each other a bit, but no one figure ruled over multiple cities. Sargon, when he rises to power, he just sort of sweeps through the region, and his dynasty goes, as far north as Syria, and covering most of Iraq as well. So he's the first real empire builder, for better or worse, and lots of myths arise around him. So many myths about how to be a good king, and so many later kings try to tie themselves to this first Sargon, including taking the name Sargon. Some of the Assyrian kings took the name Sargon when they rose to the throne. So he was a really important and powerful figure throughout the history of the region.
All right, and to be done is to find his city, Akkad,
Mhm.
which is
Yes.
somewhere in this region. We know where Kish is, we know where Uruk is, we know
Mm.
where Ur is, we know Babylon. There are other cities we've located, but not Akkad, not yet. And I've
Not
asked Moody to find it, and she said she would try, right, Moody?
absolutely.
We need a budget. We need ground penetrating radar, and we will start the search. And I believe Samara is where the scholars now point us to start there. However, we're going to turn to something that is even more magical than Sargon. That's going to school in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. If you're a school child in this period of time, you have lessons. You must learn to write, especially if you're going to grow up and be a scribe, which will make your mother very happy, male and female. However, how did they learn and why do we know about it? Moody, we found their scrap paper. What does it look like?
There are these amazing. amazing homework assignments that survive from about 4,000 years ago from the city of Nippur, a residential building that archaeologists have very charismatically named House F, where about 2,000 of these tablets have been found, if I hope I'm remembering that number correctly. And some of them are just a single wedge. So the cuneiform is a wedge-shaped writing system because it's impressed into clay with a reed stylus, and you can sort of picture the little triangles. And their very earliest attempts at this are these lovely, messy tablets with just one wedge after another, like a preschooler today practicing the letter A. It's sort of shaky and messy, doesn't fit within any of the lines, and it's just a beautiful attempt at learning. And then eventually they move on to learning words, basic math, and advance in the later parts of their career to Sumerian literature and quite advanced, I mean, to me anyway, mathematics, which they would have needed to know to carry out their responsibilities as scribes, with bureaucratic responsibilities and having to calculate things like how much grain will this field yield? Yield. So school covers all the bases. And there are also these wonderful literary works that students themselves had to copy about what life in school was like. And then they tell us that kids went to school with a lunchbox with two breads, which is maybe a sandwich, and that they had to do a bunch of stuff they didn't really want to do, and that they led these sort of wretched day-to-day lives where they were forced to learn all these things, but that they would leave the school an exalted man of learning, as one of the stories ends. So it's a really lovely insight into kids, into the messiness of learning a language, of learning a writing system, of stuff they just didn't want to do, their doodles, their bite marks. There's a wonderful tablet with a kid's teeth marks on it. And scholars have tried to reckon with it for ages, saying, well, maybe it was a way of saying this assignment is done, or maybe he was trying to break the tablet. But someone online said to me, well, who amongst us as a kid didn't just bite something for the sake of it to feel what it was like? So there are these really beautiful moments in kids' lives that are preserved in these tablets, as well as how people learned this incredible writing system that was used for thousands of years.
And some revelations that are surprising. They did mathematics, but not just mathematics, they did geometry. And not just geometry, they might have done pi and they might have done calculations that we associate with Pythagoras.
Mm-hmm.
They all of that is in their homework. So what we're talking about is a civilization that is comparable to ours. That's how we learned mathematics. We learned arithmetic,
Mm-hmm.
and they learned arithmetic. We learned geometry, and they learned geometry. I can't find a difference. Can you tell me one?
I don't think there really is one. And those who wanted to keep learning, they would go on to learn even more advanced things like the kind of mathematical astronomy that you start to see around 500 BCE. So it really is comparable. The memorizing, the learning how to write, the kind of lesson structure and the math. It's all there, and we're still doing it today.
This isn't the science of the time. This isn't the priests. This is school children, meaning that they have teachers who guide them, meaning it's commonplace in the land. What do we guess about the literacy rate and the ability to do math? Was it restricted to just these children or was it broader?
I think it depends on what period. So that the every period will have a slightly different answer to this, but overall, it was restricted to those who went to school, which did include girls, as you mentioned earlier. And but at the same time, those who needed literacy to carry out their day-to-day business activities might learn a basic set of signs to be able to write letters or keep receipts, so they didn't have to pay someone else to do it. So broadly speaking, it was restricted, but in some eras, people did teach themselves or learn from someone else so that they could do it themselves and not have to add that to their kind of list of expenses, so to speak.
And to return to the beginning, Enigaldi Nana, she
Hmm.
is in a long tradition, thousands of years of tradition of being the priestess who interprets the moon god. And that is a weighty task. I don't know that anybody ever asked her how she did, but all the princesses before her carrying this tradition, what was their what was their worth to the city? Was it a foundational priestess? Was she center of their sense of confidence?
Hmm. Yeah, I think Enigaldi Nana and the priestesses who came before her were far from just figureheads. They did, as you did mention earlier, they managed vast tracts of agricultural land. They carried out rituals that were deeply important to the people of Ur, including something called the sacred marriage ritual, which was done before the harvest. And as you can imagine, as we grapple with unpredictable climate, the climate was somewhat unpredictable in southern Iraq, what is now southern Iraq at the time, where it sort of oscillated between pouring rain and boiling hot. So these rituals were really important to give people confidence in their food security, effectively, for the coming months ahead. And as a kind of arm of the broader dynasty, the priestess helped secure power in the southern parts of the region of ancient Mesopotamia. And the very first one that we can securely say, who is Encheduanna, was the daughter of Sargon, this early empire builder who we mentioned. And she's actually also the first named author in history. So there's also an intellectual role. She wrote these beautiful, powerful hymns, not just related to her work for the moon god, but she wrote hymns to Inanna, who was a goddess of love and war, later Ishtar. So this priestess had a lot to do, and they gave up their kind of access to family, their ability to have their own families in order to carry this on. And they became this their own sort of intergenerational family where they cared for the dead priestesses who came before them in a cemetery that was near the palace, near to their dwelling. So it's this really moving, I think, role that they played. And I really wonder what their lives were like and what even things about them that we'll never know. Like with Enigaldinana, we don't know what her birth name is. We just know what her priestess name is, which is Enigaldinana. There's so much we'll never know. But I think they had such an important role in the region at the time.
Between Two Rivers, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History. Moudhy Al-Rashid is the author. I'm John Batchelor.